And we're back with another episode of Gladio Free Europe. I'm your host, Liam, joined here today by Russian Sam.
Hello, hello.
And Halal Sam.
Hello there.
On this podcast, we've talked a lot about barbarians, groups who exist or originate outside the boundaries of a sedentary society. They're never as powerful or as prosperous as the people within the walls, but they're so inherently destructive and covetous that they're always a lingering threat to us civilized folk. At least, this is how ancient historians from Britain to Baghdad to Beijing, who were part of these settled civilizations, imagined their less urban barbarian neighbors. It's a topic we've touched upon a few times previously, with episodes on the late Roman Empire, the Anglo-Saxon migrations, the Turkic migrations, and of course, most recently, the rise of the ancient Franks and the Vikings. And the topic we're returning to today, because in traditional Western historiography, the centuries from the fall of Rome to the 9th or 10th century are often understood as a migration period, in which the cultural boundaries of Europe were constantly in flux, in large part due to the arrival of newcomers from across the North Sea, from Arabia and North Africa, and even from across the Eurasian steppe. This long-term transformation had enormous implications on the history of the entire Eurasian region. The map of Europe and the Middle East in the year 400 looked nothing like how it was in the year 600, and the map by 800 was an equally dramatic change. We've talked before about how these supposed migrations of so-called barbarians had an incredibly important role in the end of the classical world and the birth of the medieval world. And in every single case, the migratory conquerors adopted the language or the religion of their steppe population. Only both. As far as I can tell, the only places where there was a complete transformation of language, religion, and identity are the places where Arab and eventually Turkic Muslim conquerors would settle, and even then, this is a process that wasn't overnight. It really wasn't even complete until the 20th century. And even today, there are populations in Turkey, in Lebanon, all across the Islamic world who still claim descent from pre-Islamic societies. So what you really see most often is not the Islamic model. What you really see is what we can call the barbarian model, where a new group comes in, destroys the previous ruling class in a certain area, and the next thing you know, they've dissolved into the broader population, and usually another group then comes and throws them out. It's this really interesting cyclical process we see all across the world. But what's interesting, though, is that eventually this process ended. There aren't any more barbarians today. And in this episode, we're going to talk about a group who I would argue were the last barbarians in Europe. A group of people who started from the humblest of beginnings, who despite unbelievable odds, went on to trade, plunder, and settle across the entire known world, ranging as far as Ireland and Wales to Sicily and Antioch. We're talking about the Normans.
Yeah, Normans. They really seem like a very simple, typical story that we've heard up until this point on the podcast, where in the early 10th century, suddenly there's a group of Vikings who are attacking France, at that point known as Western Francia, which is really just a continuation of the process that their forebears had been engaging in for nearly a century. Just like rich American kids today, the Vikings loved spending a summer in France. Yeah, so the whole thing really began with a man named either Rollo or Rolf, depending on which sources you read, but he was a Viking. He was one of these petty chieftains that we talked about a bit in the Northman episode, and he would end up establishing his own fiefdom in the northern reaches of France, right across from the English Channel in the center, right there. That's Normandy. That's where these people settled.
Right, yeah. And what's interesting is that this was happening right at the same time as other Vikings were carving out possessions in Britain and Ireland. So I think you can kind of understand this as a parallel process. Although the Vikings in France were a little bit unique because they seem to have most readily adopted the culture of the native peoples, the French speakers, the Catholics, and pretty quickly they took on this pretty interesting ethnonym that would stick around for a really long time, which was, of course, Normans, from Normanny, which obviously means Northmen.
But unlike those Vikings in the British Isles, the Normans there settled as allies and not enemies of the local Christian king. Or that was the plan, at least. The Norman dukes would constantly wage these wars against their local sworn lords. the kings of France, while also protecting France from external attacks by other Vikings, as well as internal uprisings by rival French dukes.
The only way to stop a bad guy with a Viking is a good guy with a Viking.
Exactly.
You could even make a parallel to the fact that centuries before in France, the Roman Empire was constantly hiring out barbarian groups to fight other barbarians. It's a very similar process.
The thing is, it works also. They wouldn't keep doing it if it didn't work, at least a decent portion of the time. But the thing is that unlike these other Viking conquerors, the Normans would become Catholic, and pretty quickly, within like a few generations. And then they even traded their language, their Norse language, for French, or a dialect of French.
Yeah, but despite the fact that these people were no longer visibly Scandinavian, the Normans were not really embraced with open arms by the French court writ large, because rival nobles, they really viciously attacked these people. They considered them to be basically pirates who had gotten one up on them and who need to be repelled mercilessly. And then a bit later, the enemies of the Normans in southern Europe would see the later Normans as hardly any better than their pagan grandfathers, which just goes to show that they were perpetual foreigners in this medieval high society, and they just had a certain stench to them, the stench of barbarism. No matter how hard you scrub, you just can't get away from it.
That's how I see Scandinavians today.
Well, in any case, in just about 150 years, the Normans would go from part-time warriors in one of the most isolated parts of Europe to being rulers of England and Sicily, with possessions as far off as Tunisia and Antioch. They would even arguably become a major power behind the throne of France. So I think that their story is basically without parallel in medieval history, because they were able to rise so far into the heights of, European aristocracy, and also do it so late. So many centuries after previous earlier barbarian groups had done this. But even though it's kind of a unique story, I think it does explain a lot about this pretty interesting time period. So in this episode, we are going to dive deep into the icy waters of North Sea history to examine where exactly the Normans came from, and how Western Europe's last barbarians were able to make their mark on the history of not only France, but also half of Christendom. More importantly, we're going to talk about how these people saw themselves and how they were seen by others in the pretty intolerant context of medieval Christian society. So put on your hauberk and fill your horn with some apple cider, because we are going Norman.
So in the early 10th century, the Viking phenomenon was really at its height. And for well over a century, men and women from Scandinavia would periodically board these fearsome longships to raid and trade with communities all across the rivers and seaways of Western Eurasia.
Yeah, and this was very much a global phenomenon. That's what we need to underline time and again, because it's remarkable just how global these people were. They were raiding as far east as the Caspian Sea, like near modern-day Kazakhstan. They were trading as far south as Baghdad, even though they were plugged into these trade networks that span the entire globe. Recall, for example, in our previous Vikings episode where we talked about the Buddha that had been discovered in a Viking grave all the way in Sweden.
Yeah, and there's another grave. I think it's the Osberg ship, I believe. One of the people buried in this very high status grave appears to have been a woman from Iran, interestingly.
Oh yeah, we talked about this on the Rus episode. Yeah, lots of continuity. We've been building up to this point for so long, and finally all the threads are starting to come together. And
that point about continuity is really important, because so the Normans really were their own thing. They were understood as a specific, unique group, but so much about them echoes previous processes we've seen in the history of Europe during the Viking Age, and then even earlier in the migration period.
Yeah. So just to give another example, in the Byzantine Empire of the 9th to 10th centuries, you had an institution called the Varangian Guards, who were basically bodyguards for the emperor, who were themselves Vikings in origin.
It's so wild. And back to France, or West Francia at the time, thanks to its very navigable river systems and relatively prosperous cities and archipelago of wealthy monasteries, France was really the ideal place for plunder. And if you're a plundering people, that's where you're going to go. And because the grandparents of these Franks had been pretty barbaric themselves, France was filled with treasures plundered from across Europe and the Mediterranean during the wars of Charlemagne.
Also, we should mention that the very notorious Frankish succession system meant that every single king was basically obliged to split up his empire amongst all of his sons equally, which led to constant division and also constant civil wars that drew up a lot of the attention and military power of the various Frankish kingdoms.
Yeah, they really didn't have a good succession system. They should have learned from the Ottomans.
The French have never been known for getting along, have they?
No, they have not.
Yeah. Well, all this came together to mean that raiding France would eventually become a way of life for the Vikings. They would go everywhere. There'd be Vikings in Russia. There were Vikings trading in Baghdad, like we talked about. A lot of them would settle in the British Isles. But France was one of the best prizes for plunder.
Now, when did that start? When did these Vikings first come into contact with the Franks?
Pretty early, just a few years after Lindisfarne in England, which was the first recorded Viking raid. But what's interesting is that even though it was early, you could make the argument that the Vikings didn't necessarily draw first blood. Because around the year 800, the Franks completed their conquest of Saxony, one of the last pagan holdouts in continental Western Europe. And suddenly, this meant that the Franks, known to be a very expansionist kingdom, especially during the time of Charlemagne, when this was, the Franks were suddenly right up against the border of Denmark, which had probably pretty recently been formed as a kingdom. So the Danes seemed to be pretty spooked at what was happening, and they seemed to have feared that they might be next. According to Janet Nelson, there was even a popular phrase in Germany at the time, which was that a Frank will either be your friend or your neighbor.
So either a friend or Flanders.
Yes, exactly. So starting in 800, some Danish Vikings began conducting these seaborne raids along the coast of Charlemagne's empire, especially in Frisia in the Low Countries, but also France itself. However, most of these early raids were really quickly repelled. But then in 814, Charlemagne dies, and of course, as we talked about, his empire is immediately divided between his sons and grandsons. The Viking raids don't stop, though. And now that the great Frankish Empire has been split apart and is constantly, fighting between its own former constituent kingdoms, the Vikings have a perfect opportunity. And this, after 814, is when Viking raids on France and the Low Countries become a constant occurrence and really never let up. The weaker Carolingian kings were not able to stop them. If you ever played Crusader Kings, when you're fighting a war like on one front and then you get some raiders on the other side of the country, you don't always want to pull your troops out, right? So Vikings weren't necessarily considered a priority. These tended to be small raids, and even though they were often quite destructive, these major dynastic wars were the main priority of the various Carolingian kings.
Yeah, no, the raids were a distraction at that time.
Exactly. But the thing is, these kinds of distractions, they snowball. And so in the 9th and eventually 10th century, they were getting so bad that the Vikings were able to strike France multiple times a year. You've got records all across the country of Vikings appearing. They, come in one day, they plunder a monastery, and then they're gone. In the 840s, actually, 2 subsequent dukes of Gascony were killed defending Western France from Vikings. So here's a tip. If you're ever offered the job of Duke of Gascony, say no.
I'll keep that in mind. So we know how the process goes, right? The Vikings, they would just land their ships on the coast or the riverbank, wherever they were, and they just get out, plunder the local town or monastery, burn some stuff, kill some people, take some slaves maybe, and then be days away by the time the army actually shows up, if they even show up at all, which would have been a big question in this period when the facilities of the state were so clearly weak.
I'm sure that plundering the monasteries would have been particularly scandalous also.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And the nunneries especially.
Yeah, which just really goes to show that it's not that these people were in and of themselves really fearsome warriors compared to the warriors of the people whom they'd be plundering. It's more just that they had very different cultural tastes and so didn't see anything wrong with plundering a monastery because that's where they keep all their nice stuff without many guards. So obviously that makes sense. But in and of themselves, they probably weren't any more bloodthirsty or any of those things compared to the people they'd be raiding. They were just jumping in very quickly before anyone really realized what would be going on.
Yeah. And that's the thing, it was speed, it was stealth, because the Vikings could be anywhere at any time, pretty much. There was really no way to contain them. And as the years grew on, the Vikings started getting bolder. They would build these bases, especially on river islands where they could camp out for the winter. And then that meant that they could suddenly have an entire another season of raiding before they have to go back home. So this meant that they could penetrate really deep into France. Nowhere was safe, no matter how inland. Even there's some mountain towns where the Vikings managed to get up there just to see what was up, if they had any monasteries to plunder. And you kind of get why a lot of Christians at this time believed that these attacks had to be a punishment sent by God. Because if you're a French civilian, there is no hope to deliver you from the fury of the Northmen. You're out of luck.
Yeah, the state isn't going to help you.
No, especially not. Again, because they were constantly occupied with these dynastic wars in Europe.
And there were also attacks by land-based raiders at the same time. And like Liam said, they did not have the capacity to respond to this. And during these same decades, there were Arab pirates who held a fort at modern-day Saint-Tropez, and local Christians were totally unable to dislodge them for almost a century, which is pretty wild. And also some Hungarian tribesmen would occasionally raid across Germany into France. And Burgundy was also raided by Vikings and Arabs and Hungarians and such.
That was in the same year. Burgundy had all three of those.
Truly a golden age for barbarians.
Yeah. And it gets and the worst of these raids would happen in the middle of the 9th century during the reign of Charles the Bald, a grandson of Charlemagne. First things first, Charles the Bald, probably not actually bald, because we actually have pictures of him made in his reign, and he had plenty of hair. It might have been a reference to how he was initially crownless, because he didn't have a kingdom as early as his brothers, but Janet Nelson thinks it's actually an ironic joke. Like maybe because he had long hair, they called him the Bald. Kind of reminds me of how in mafia movies, if there's a bald guy, you call him curly. If there's a fat guy, you call him slim. And I think this kind of makes sense to me because the Carolingians, in a sense, were Europe's biggest mafia family at this time.
Yeah, this was back in the good old days when the mafia was still Germanic.
So Charles the Bald had all the hallmarks of a Carolingian ruler. Endlessly tedious wars of succession against his brothers and cousins, internal rebellions, which caused the slow waning of central authority, and constant foreign invasions by groups like the Vikings.
Right, and so by the early 840s, he was having a pretty rough time. He was fighting a war against his brother Lothair of, the Kingdom of Lotharingia, you guys might have heard of. And around this time, he'd make the famous Oaths of Strasbourg we talked about with Natasha in our episode on the Franks, which is sort of the earliest recorded text in the French language. He also dealt with the rebellion by the Bretons, which he lost pretty badly. And this rebellion ended up turning Brittany in northwestern France into essentially an independent kingdom for the next 700 years. Janet Nelson is convinced that Vikings were totally clued in to what was happening in the Carolingian world, because that they chose to strike at moments of perceived weakness. This was when they ended up going into southern France, where they hadn't gone as much before, where they managed to kill those two Dukes of Gascony. And eventually, they even set their sights on the grandest prize of all, the capital city of Paris. In 841, a group of Vikings led by a man called Ragnar began plundering the Seine River. Scandinavian accounts traditionally associate this guy with the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. If you've seen the History Channel show, he's the Viking with the dreamy eyes. Because Charles the Bald was unable to deal with this threat, he decided to buy him off with a tactic that we've talked about before and that we're going to talk about again, which is giving a tiny bit of land to the barbarians. So Charles the Bald grabs a tiny corner of Flanders at the very edge of his kingdom and says, Ragnar, just settle there and we'll stop fighting. And it seems like Ragnar was happy with the solution. But then Charles would make a really big mistake. It turned out that other Frankish aristocrats were unhappy with Ragnar suddenly being among their ranks. They didn't like that. This smelly pagan barbarian, why does he get to have land in France? So they convinced Charles to withdraw his land gift. So I guess, I don't know if it happened when Ragnar was away or what, but Charles essentially evicts Ragnar, takes back that plot of land in Flanders, and tells Ragnar he's out of luck. So in 845, seeking revenge, Ragnar decides, all right, if he takes my home, I'm going to take his home. And so Ragnar assembles a massive fleet of Viking longships and sails up the Seine toward Paris. Supposedly he had an armada of more than 100 ships, which was unheard of at this time.
Yeah, this must have looked like the apocalypse to these people.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The Seine would have probably been, clogged up by these, dragon ships.
It looks like a fucking alien invasion.
How many people could one of these ships carry?
That's a great question. I know that writers at the time said something like, that there were something like 7,000 troops, which sounds crazy because that would have meant 70 people per ship. But I bet that you could probably fit at least like 20 guys in one of those ships, right? So it probably was in the low thousands, I would think. Because this was such a big invasion fleet, Charles knew they were coming, so he managed to assemble an army to meet them. But he ended up doing it in probably the most boneheaded way you can. Because he had half of his army go on one side of the river and half of his army go on the other. His hope was that, when the Vikings see they're surrounded with an army on each side, they would just turn home. But they tried something else that he didn't anticipate. The Vikings landed on one side of the river, fought that army, and won, and Charles and his soldiers had to watch helplessly from the other side, because there was no way to cross the river on foot.
Man, this is some genius military planning.
Incredible.
Truly great strategy. Really, one for the ages. So Charles and his men hightail it out of there, get back in the city walls, and next thing they know, the Vikings in their 100 longships have totally surrounded the island of Paris. And now they just wait. Interestingly, there's a report that 111 Frankish soldiers were captured and publicly hanged in full view of the citizens. And some historians think this actually might have been a specific religious ritual, like some kind of blood sacrifice to Odin, because there's a lot of references in the scant references we have to Norse religion as it was practiced indicate that these kinds of ritualistic hangings were pretty common. But really, to add insult to injury, eventually they did break into the city, and it happened on the holiest of Christian days, Easter morning.
At that point, I'm just assuming that, this is the apocalypse. It's over.
Interestingly, by all accounts, the Vikings were actually somewhat well-behaved. They showed remarkable restraint. They didn't plunder or slaughter as much as they were expected to.
What's the tradition? What is the French view on this? Why do they think that these barbarians were kind to them?
Well, according to the French folk tradition, it's because the Vikings were so amazed by the Christian piety they saw on display that Easter morning that they decided to show mercy, which is pretty funny. But what I think is more likely is that they were probably immediately bribed by King Charles, because we know that he ended up totally losing his shirt and giving them 7,000 pounds of gold and silver, which was just an unbelievable amount at the time, which was kind of a scandal across Christendom. Just giving these pirates, these pagans, so much money.
And on Easter morning, after they did a blood sacrifice to Odin?
Yes. Yeah, you can imagine how, freaked out they would be. But it worked, and so the Vikings returned back to Scandinavia, making sure to plunder a couple extra monasteries on the way back. Ragnar was so eager to take the treasures back home that he even grabbed beams from the roof of a church and wooden pegs from the walls of Paris, just to show off to his friends that he'd humiliated the kingdom once held by the great Charlemagne. King Charles had hoped that by giving so much money to the Vikings, they would stop all further raids and satisfy them, but instead, as soon as the Danish royal court found out about the amount of wealth that was in France, they all wanted a piece of the pie. And so suddenly, many, many, many more groups of Vikings are going to sail into France, especially to Paris. I think that there would be something like 3 more attempted sieges, and every time they would get bought off again by, taking this a big prize. The English would call it a Danegeld to go home. And it became a huge expense on the French economy, and it was a huge boon to these Vikings and really incentivized these kinds of raids.
Yeah, as the old saying goes, once you pay the Danegeld, the Dane goes away.
Exactly, yes. Sadly not. Eventually, Charles the Bald was succeeded by his nephew, Charles the Fat, who, by the way, apparently was not that fat.
These are mean nicknames.
Charles the Fat was one of the most powerful of all the Carolingian rulers because he actually united Charlemagne's empire for a short time. He was simultaneously king of Italy, France, and Germany, which is pretty impressive. This seems to have been why when the Vikings returned again in 885, which probably was the biggest of all of these siege attempts in Paris, Charles the Fat was much more prepared than previous kings.
Did he finally build some fucking bridges?
They did, you're right, yeah. They built bridges. They had fortifications all across the Seine because they knew that these guys would be coming back. So they sort of built this kind of medieval Maginot Line, this huge series of fortifications in expectation of this foreign invader. But just like the real Maginot Line 1,000 years later, this kind of defense only works if your enemy behaves the way you expect them to. Unfortunately, the new group of Vikings in 885 shocked the Franks because these guys had state-of-the-art siege engines. No one knows really how they got them. Probably they were captured in England or in other raids in France, but suddenly the Vikings have catapults and ballistas, which are much more effective at busting down walls and destroying these kinds of fortifications.
So even though the second siege of Paris involved a bigger invading force than the first, the Frankish defenses ended up being way too strong for the Vikings to immediately overcome. But because of their new besieging capabilities, they were more able to encircle the island of Paris and besiege them for 11 agonizing months. 11 months under siege is not something you want to be, a situation you want to be in.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah. And remember, so Paris is an island, and at this point, it was only an island. So I have to think that, like, there must have been mass starvation, because how do you survive for 11 months? Were they buying food from the Vikings? I'd be surprised.
I wouldn't be surprised, honestly. That's perfect grind set right there, just,
Maybe so. But, really, too, I think they must have been really especially annoyed because they could look outside the walls and they could see the Vikings basically setting up shop. They started, the Viking camps became increasingly permanent. And I think they started fearing that maybe these Vikings didn't want to want to leave as quickly as they'd gotten there. It seems like around this time, a city called Rouen in the north of Normandy, what's now Normandy, would be permanently captured by Vikings. And this is a city that would remain essentially the heart of Normandy even today. I don't know if they could tell at the time, but this capture was pretty important. Eventually, to make matters even worse, during the siege, some of the vassals of Charles the Fat in Burgundy decided to take advantage of the chaos and stage a revolt. At least you'd think this would be disastrous, but it ended up being an amazing opportunity for Charles the Fat.
Yeah, so Charles sent envoys out to meet with the Danish besiegers to find out what these people want. And one of these men who happened to be among the besiegers was a young guy named Rollo. So Charles made Rollo an offer he can't refuse. Rollo and his men would leave Paris and keep sailing up the Seine until they dealt with the revolting Burgundians, to which the Vikings agreed. And they would just set up shop there, promise to never besiege Paris, but this is ultimately the origin point of the Normans.
So after this 11-month siege, and then this kind of consolation prize of getting to ravage through Burgundy, a lot of the Vikings weren't that eager to get back to Scandinavia. Obviously, France has a much nicer climate and lifestyle, and just to make this clear, to give some context, at this time in the early Middle Ages, it was impossible to grow wheat in most of Scandinavia. Only rye and barley could grow. Grapes were just as bad. So many food items that we consider totally basic were incredibly valuable luxury goods that had to be imported from Central and Southern Europe. So a lot of these Vikings, simply because of the climate, wanted to stay in France.
Yeah, we talked on the previous episode about how the Vikings who were coming to Britain, of all places, were raving about how great the climate was compared to where they were coming from. So, I mean, by that metric, France would be an even more attractive destination than Britain.
And so one of the Vikings who decided to stay in France was that guy named Rollo. He is maybe the main character of our story today. Super important guy. One of those cases where it really does seem like individual decisions have a significant impact on the course of at least regional history. Because Rollo did not want to go back to France. Instead, he thought that maybe France could be his home, perhaps even his kingdom. And what's possibly most amazing about Rollo, however, is that even though he was presumably this illiterate pagan Viking, we know a lot about him because a biography was written about him essentially in living memory. Although, unfortunately, this biography might not be as reliable as we'd hope.
So Dudo of St. Quentin was this poet and probably a layperson in 10th century France, and he was hired to write a biography of Rollo in the 980s. But, little spoiler here, by this time Rollo had already been dead for 50 years, but his descendants were incredibly powerful in France, and this really was the puff piece. A lot of historians are pretty skeptical about it, but it's still the best source we've got.
Yeah, and so just for an example of why historians are skeptical, or at least why they notice a bias, this is the opening of Dudo's History, which is a poem addressed to Rollo's grandson, Richard.
O you as magnanimous, compassionate, moderate, O you as extraordinary, God-fearing, O you as eminent, upright king, O you as wonderful, good, and righteous, O you as peacemaking as the progeny of God, O you as generous, sacred, moderate, O you as very bright, merciful, Richard, O you as patient, judicious, Richard. Oh man, can I stop now? It's already too much.
I guess this was kind of typical in the early Middle Ages, this kind of really obsequious flattery. But yeah, so that's how he opens the history. But it is an interesting document because it tells an interesting story, and it really tells you a lot about how the Normans, not that long after Rollo, thought about their ancestor and, their Viking past. So according to Dudo, Rollo was the son of a powerful chieftain in Denmark who ran afoul of an evil Danish king. Eventually, his father was murdered, causing Rollo to flee Scandinavia and seek a new life as a wandering Viking. If this sounds familiar, it's basically the exact same setup as the Northmen. Pretty funny.
Yeah, so Rollo first he goes to England, where he visits these new Viking kingdoms that had been set up in the wake of the wars against the Christian kingdoms and Alfred the Great. It seems like he really struck up a great friendship with the Viking king Guthrum, who, as we recall, was the king of East Anglia. Yeah, this was the Last Kingdom episode, I believe it was.
Yeah. So Guthrum had just become Christian and took the name Athelstan, and according to Dudo, he had really all the zeal of a convert, because Guthrum immediately insists to his new friend Rollo that he has to be a Christian too. But Rollo has some doubts, until something strange happens.
So one night, while he's sleeping in Guthrum's hall, Rollo has a dream. And in this dream, he's suffering from leprosy and fighting the pain of this terrible disease to climb a mountain. The mountain is a lot higher than anything in England, but also not as icy or jagged as the mountains back home in Scandinavia. So he gets to the top of the mountain and sees a bubbling fountain. He washes his body in the water, and miraculously, his leprous pustules disappear.
Right, and so Rollo thinks this dream has to mean something, so he asks around. And Guthrum says, oh, it's obvious. This dream obviously means you have to become a Christian. The leprosy means paganism, and the fountain is baptism. And then he thinks, oh, and that mountain that isn't in England or in Denmark or Norway, that's France. You, Rollo, you got to become a Christian in France.
Wow, this is some Ben Garrison shit.
So Rollo leaves England and starts praying for the first time to the Christian God, but he isn't baptized yet. And actually, the prayer that Dudo quotes here even says, "Even though I'm a pagan, listen to my prayer. But I promise God, I'm going to become a Christian after one last little pagan act."
Just one more time.
Well, the one last job kind of thing. So he says, I'm going to go to France one more time, one last raid, and then I'm getting baptized. So he joins up with the second siege of Paris, this time secretly planning on getting baptized after they win. And again, this is why historians are skeptical, right? Like, I find it very hard to believe that any of the Vikings involved in that siege the whole time were secretly planning on becoming Christians. They had this, calendar event on their phone, like, oh yeah, tomorrow, alarm, become a Christian.
Well, as we've seen, these people were masters of the grind set, so don't put it past them.
That's true, yeah. Eventually, after the siege of Paris, Rollo marries a young French woman named Papa. She's a commoner from the town of Bayeux, and really all Dudo says about her is that she was pretty, which was, kind of typical medieval male chauvinism. But interestingly, Dudo's word choice also suggests that this marriage was somehow not fully legitimate. She was his wife, but not really. And so some historians think this just means that Papa and Rollo were married in a pagan ceremony rather than in a Christian church. But I think it's also possible that this could hint at the kind of very complicated polygamy and different tiers of marriage that existed among the Vikings. We talked about in the Northman episode, but it seems like this is the kind of thing that the Normans are going to keep on for a while. So we said before that a lot of Scandinavian traditions are not going to survive the migration to France, but some of them do. And perhaps one of the least savory of these traditions is this kind of insistence on a man being able to have more than one spouse.
The Normans were sex positive and poly.
That's true, yeah. Eventually, Rollo would capture the town of Rouen that we talked about before. And in this town, I think here he's convinced that, oh yeah, I really got to go along and get baptized. So according to Dudo, he assembles another grand army to march back to Paris. But this time, he's not marching to Paris for conquest. He's marching to tell the king that he's going to be baptized. But that in exchange for his baptism, the king has to give him a whole bunch of land.
Yeah, like I said, grind set.
Yeah. So this time he meets with a new king who, surprise, surprise, is also named Charles. This one is Charles the Simple, and again, not that simple of a guy.
Man, France really loves having kings with the same name over and over again.
Oh god, yeah. Yeah, it's Charles or Louis. It's gotta be.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, simple had a different meaning at the time where it meant more like honest. Yeah, not really just dumb. Although he had other nicknames relating to him being an idiot, so it's pretty obvious why those two names coincided.
Well, I'll say this, is that Charles was definitely not an idiot, but he also was much more honest than Charles the Bald, because he gives Rollo this huge swath of land, much larger than what had been offered to Ragnar previously, but he also doesn't take it back. He makes an honest deal with this guy, Rollo, even though he's a pagan. And, in exchange for getting this huge gift of land, Rollo finally accepts Christianity. Supposedly it's he's promised to become baptized many years before. Now he finally accepts Christianity.
So to really seal the deal, Dudo writes that after Rollo was baptized, he became part of the French royal family by marrying Gisela, who was the daughter of Charles the Simple.
Although let's take a step back here, because what's kind of funny is that even though Dudo mentions that there was a princess named Gisela, she actually doesn't come up in any French records at this time. And also, Charles was something like 32 years old, so it's mathematically basically impossible that he could have had a daughter of marriageable age. I think it's most likely that this Princess Gisela never actually existed. I think it was probably she was probably an invention of Dudo or another writer to justify later Norman ambitions to the throne of France. Oh, see, we're already part of the family. My great-grandfather already married your sister or whatever. It's also possible, and I think a lot more fun, that maybe they kind of tricked Rollo into doing what he thought was a royal marriage. They've got some girl in the court and they pass her off as a princess. There's stranger things have happened.
Yeah, that sounds like a zany 80s comedy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. She goes to Rollo's camp and has to pretend to be a princess, even though she's never she can't read, she doesn't know how to dance. Yeah. Hilarity ensues. In any case though, whether or not this marriage actually happened, Rollo himself was not single. Again, he was married to that woman named Papa. So, which again also indicates that he might not have been exactly as pious of a Christian as Dudo insists. Eventually, after being given this huge grant of land and accepting Jesus Christ, Rollo returns to Normandy, his new territory. But first, Dudo ends the story of Rollo's life with one pretty funny anecdote.
And so the king has given him his daughter, Gisela by name, as his wife, as well as the prescribed land from the river Epte to the sea as a heritable estate. The bishops then said to Rollo, "Whoever receives such gifts ought kiss the king's foot." Rollo said, "I will never kneel before the knees of another, nor will I kiss anyone's foot." Thus, Rollo ordered one of his warriors to kiss the king's foot instead. This warrior grabbed hold of the king's foot and pulled it up to his own mouth, causing the king to topple backward. He brought the foot to his mouth while standing upright, and so great laughter and great uproar is occasioned among the people.
And then everybody clapped.
Yeah, this was back when Germanics had a sense of humor.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the last time a Danish person told a joke. So by the time Rollo died in the 930s, he'd carved out one of the largest duchies in France, which guarded the sea route to England, and was also within striking distance of Brittany, the Low Countries, and even Paris itself.
Which is pretty wild, honestly, that they were given land so close to Paris.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah, and they were very close to Paris, diplomatically too, because even if he never actually married a princess, There were very close relations, both good and bad, between the French kings and the Norman dukes for a really long time. They were both allies and enemies in the many, many civil wars that would tear apart France. This, one thing that I think that the Dudo story does seem to make it very clear is that Rollo had a very public conversion to Christianity, while apparently keeping certain, pagan traditions, like wanting to have more than one wife. His family would eventually be called simply the House of Normandy, and they would jump in a single generation from farmers and part-time pirates to being at the beating heart of European politics. And so I gotta say, yeah, whoever said the Middle Ages had no social mobility.
If you want it, you can just grind and raid.
And they did. They certainly did.
Yeah, Rollo was basically a medieval Steve Jobs, if you think about it.
I would even go so far as to argue that what the Normans did, as these totally foreign barbarians who managed to get a seat at the imperial table, this is the kind of thing that barbarians had been trying to do, and since the time of Brennus in 400 BC when he sacked Rome. And usually they failed. Brennus made a lot of money, but he wasn't able to establish a permanent, lasting legacy. Centuries after Brennus, you've got figures like Odoacer and Theodoric in Italy, but after the fall of Rome. But again, their territories quickly fell apart. Not so with Normandy. Normandy would remain as a recognizable cultural region up until the present, and this Duchy of Normandy that Rollo would establish would become this jumping off point for much, much more Norman activity all across the medieval world. Obviously, England would be their most famous prize, but as we mentioned, there would even be Normans in the Holy Land and Italy. We're going to take a break now, but when we get back, we're going to figure out why exactly the Normans were so good at what they did, and also why no other barbarians would ascend to power in Europe after this. And we're also going to talk about, or at least kind of hint at, the many, many exploits of Normans after Rollo. And just, by the way, I think this is probably going to be a multi-part series, because the Normans, they really were everywhere, and there's so many fun stories we can tell. Getting back into this, it seems like Rollo's descendants would certainly try plenty of the wine, because they pretty quickly ingratiated themselves with the culture of France, to an extent that it actually seemed to have peeved other members of the Norman elite. It's really kind of goes to show that you can never please anybody, because if you're a Norman, the Vikings that your dad came with, they think you're too French, and the French people, they think you're just a Viking, so you're stuck in the middle.
If you really think about it, these guys were in the same situation as third or fourth generation Italian American kids are in, where it's they're Italian in name, but aside from Gabagool or whatever, their family isn't really Italian in any other sense.
I really would hope there was Norman diaspora poetry, just a Norman Rupi Kaur.
In any case, Rollo would be succeeded by his son, William Longsword, who I think is probably one of the coolest names of the medieval era, So I gotta think, if your name is William Longsword, you can't be that domesticated, right? He did, however, try to build stronger relations with the church, and interestingly, it seems like he specifically funded monasteries that had been destroyed by other Vikings like his father.
He was just doing reparations.
Yeah, basically was, yeah, no. So yeah, in some ways, William was a pretty good friend of the church, but he did make one big mistake, which was that, just like his dad, he couldn't stomach the idea of having only one wife.
The Joseph Smith problem.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So when William's second wife, a Breton woman named Sproda, had a son named Richard, he decided that this kid was going to be his heir. But in the eyes of the church, Sproda wasn't a wife at all. She was a mistress, and this son would be a bastard. Again, kind of a common problem we'll see among the Normans. Richard was illegitimate in the eyes of the church, but William insisted, no, he's my son, he's the son of my wife, it's fine. And so he insisted that that Richard would be his heir. William also made enemies among the Frankish elite, because he kept inviting more and more Danish and Norwegian warriors to settle in exchange for military service. And, I wonder if maybe this was meant to placate the hardline Vikings already working with him, But this meant that it only compounded the Scandinavian presence in Normandy.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense from a strategic point of view because the local population obviously isn't very happy to see you there. So instead of relying on them to defend you, you could just put up incentives to get your own people to come over and settle. And they would have been glad to do this because, again, one of the problems that exacerbated the Viking Age was that there just wasn't enough land in Scandinavia to go around. So if you offer these guys a nice estate, then yeah, sure.
And again, it's also not good land if you can't grow fucking wheat.
No, exactly. Yeah, France is much more arable. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. But by any account, the French aristocrats were furious at the invitation of these crypto-pagans into their midst. The Normans were seen as insincere in their baptism, and William's insistence on polygamy and this invitation of other foreigners was seen as a blow to the entire dignity of Christendom.
And as one anonymous French writer wrote, hissing with spite, like dogs to their own vomit, these Northmen return to their pagan ways. Very subtle.
Yeah, ouch.
Yeah, so as you can tell from that quote, these Normans, they were seen as particularly untrustworthy and just uncivilized in general. Liam earlier mentioned the show Vikings, which isn't a great show, but one of the arcs that they had that I found very compelling was the way they presented Rollo trying to integrate himself into the French court with Gisela at his side, who thinks he's a disgusting barbarian, and he eats it with his hands while everyone else is refined with their forks and knives and that kind of stuff. And these people were just genuinely seen as pretty much demons, like total others.
Right. And I guess maybe given the social context the French aristocrats came up in, you have to cut them some slack for being so intolerant toward the Normans. But I think that what you can't cut them some slack for is the fact that this was not just prejudice. These attitudes toward the Normans led to a lot of really underhanded, violent tactics that were many unsuccessful attempts to remove the Normans from Normandy. And, I don't want to draw too many parallels to the present, but I do think that there seems to be this attitude among the French aristocrats at this time, which is a very imperial colonial attitude you see today, which is that when your enemy is uniquely distrustworthy or uniquely uncivilized, then you yourself must use distrustworthy and uncivilized tactics to fight them. Force is the only language they know. On one especially notorious occasion, French lords assembled in Germany for a conference with the Holy Roman Emperor. But when William Longsword got there, he saw they locked the door to keep him out of the meeting. William was furious about this after having traveled all the way from Normandy to Germany for this, and so he demanded an apology from all of the French nobles. Eventually, after a lot of asking, one noble, the Count of Flanders, agreed to meet and give an apology. So, William Longsword gets a group of his bodyguards and sails to a sandy island in the Somme River to meet with the Count. He eventually gets there and sees a group of Flemish warriors, but when he gets closer, he realizes the Count wasn't among them. It was a trap. But before William could turn back, the Flemish soldiers rushed at his boat. He was overwhelmed and outnumbered and murdered in the Somme. Shortly after, a Norman court poet wrote a funeral elegy that survives today.
Born overseas from a father who stuck to the pagan error, and from a mother who was devoted to the sweet religion, William was blessed from the holy chrism, shed tears for William, who died innocently. O William, defender of peace and love, consoler of the poor, and defender of orphans, and protector of the widows who is now joined to the heavenly joy, shed tears for William, who died innocently.
I had to look up what chrism meant, and apparently it's a mix of holy water and oil. Who knew? But in any case, this huge betrayal of the Treaty of Rollo was intended to eliminate the Normans, but instead, this killing would inadvertently lead the Normans to rise to heights previously unthinkable within France. Because after William's murder, the duchy would pass to his son Richard, again, who is a bastard according to the French law. But I think this really gave Richard a chip on his shoulder. His father has been murdered by, a count who was supposed to be his ally, and even though he sees himself as legitimately born and as a Catholic, the rest of the country sees him as a bastard. So he knows he has to fight twice as hard. He's only 10 years old, and just a year after he comes to power, the French King Louis IV and the Breton King Hugh launch a joint invasion of Normandy, intending to remove the Normans from power and overturn this child count. The Bretons easily cut into Normandy, but the French army was overstretched, and they suffered heavy losses in their attempted assault. King Louis realized that during this war, which was supposed to be pretty easy, he had lost so many troops that suddenly the army of Brittany was a lot larger than the army of France, which is a pretty troubling situation, right? If the Bretons who live in this one tiny corner of France now have potentially enough troops to take over a much bigger part of the country. So King Louis makes a pretty crazy and incredibly consequential calculation. He switches sides in the war that he started. He apologizes to Count Richard for trying to destroy this territory, and instead, he pledges his own daughter to Richard and convinces him to work with him to kick out the Bretons instead. This would mark the start of a 200-year period of close cooperation between the Normans and the French court, and it would set the stage for the kind of intimate politics between Normans and Frenchmen that we talked about in our Line of Winter episode 6 months ago. Also during all of this, Richard's children began forming closer ties with the other neighboring kingdom, the English. Richard's daughter, Princess Emma, married 2 successive English kings, Ethelred and the famous Viking Canute, friend of the pod. After Canute conquered England, Richard's son, Richard II, hedged his bets by welcoming evicted English princes, who were actually his nephews, Emma's sons from reverse marriage, to the Norman court, while encouraging Emma to marry Canute, the new conquering king. This way, the alliance with England would stay, even though a Viking guy had just thrown out the old king. Eventually, when Canute's empire would later fall apart, the Normans would then welcome Scandinavian elites to settle as well. Richard II, called Richard the Good, was a huge donor to the church and also patronized a lot of secular art and literature. He was the guy who commissioned that incredibly flowery poem about Rollo by Dudo that we mentioned. Yeah. Richard was also the first ruler to be known as a duke, and the Duchy of Normandy would remain a really important political entity within France and England for a very long time. Also, interestingly, we have some coins that seem to show that he also calls himself a king, which is kind of funny, because, he wasn't. No one recognized him as a king. But I guess, he thinks he's a cool enough guy. He's already a duke. Why not just, kind of embellish a little bit on the coinage?
If you're printing your own coins, you can just say anything you want on them, honestly. So eventually Richard II would die, and that led to a long period of chaos and civil war between various princes and bishops, and the young Duke Robert became the unsteady new ruler of Normandy. And Robert was incredibly ambitious, but unfortunately he was not that talented.
Yeah, and so by now, the English princes raised at Richard II's court were now grown. And so hoping to resurrect the English alliance, Robert actually launched the first failed Norman invasion of England to place his cousins on the throne. But bad weather meant that they couldn't even reach the English shores, and so the whole idea was abandoned. Dejected, Duke Robert went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but got sick and died along the way, which is kind of the typical loser ending of medieval rulers. And in another nickname that sounds like a mean joke, Robert's descendants would go on to call him Robert the Magnificent. We have to mention, though, that none of these descendants were legitimate. Robert does not seem to have been married, either in the Catholic sense or in the pagan sense of Rollo. But he did have one son with a mistress, a tanner's daughter named Erleva. Can anybody guess the name of this 7-year-old son who succeeded Robert?
Well, technically, at the time, it was William the Bastard.
But eventually, yeah, that's right. But then 30 years later, William the Bastard would be known as William the Conqueror. And I would say with both of those nicknames, unlike some of the nicknames we've talked about so far, I think Bastard and Conqueror, pretty apt descriptions of his behavior and character. Yeah, we can't get into the Norman conquest today. The Normans in England are a huge, huge topic we've talked about before. We'll probably turn to them again in the future. But I think this was a very consequential decision, for the Normans to this time successfully push into England. Really changes the course of history, and especially the course of the English language. Because I think something like 20% of the words we're using actually are in English are from Norman French.
Yeah, so around the same time, in the early 11th centuries, the Normans were looking for fame and fortune even beyond France and England. So they, following the habits of their grandfathers who had themselves transplanted themselves into Normandy, the Normans were now leading expeditions into the Mediterranean, which would eventually bring them into conflict with both the Byzantine Emperor and the Pope.
Yes, a very famous Norman knight named Robert Guiscard, which translates to the fox, the wily, the cunning, or even the weasel. He would end up conquering Sicily and half of the Italian boot with the help of his warrior queen, Sicilgaita. But this is going to be a topic for another episode. We're wrapping up here. That's basically, that is the story of the early Normans. You know, we've seen how they've gone from Vikings to a very, I guess you could say, very idiosyncratic part of the French nobility, who were never fully accepted, but managed to be incredibly powerful despite that. I think as a way to kind of close this off, there are a few questions we can ask about Norman society as a whole. And a lot of these are open questions. There might not be good answers. But I think that one of the most commonly asked questions, which has spurred one of the fiercest debates among medieval historians, is the question of how Viking were the Normans exactly?
That's a great question, and great in the sense of there's a million different people who think a million different things. So this is a very active debate even until this day. Some experts like Eleanor Sierra insist that the Normans introduced a new political system and military institutions to France, which they themselves had inherited from the Vikings, and arguably this contributed to the Norman adventurism overseas because it gave them a competitive edge that the people they would have been raiding couldn't keep up against.
Yeah, which is a legitimate argument. But other historians, especially those in France, funnily enough, tend to downplay the Scandinavian character of the Normans and instead argue that the Norman elite quickly adopted the ways of the Franks. And I think that, in a sense, it's possible that both of these arguments are true, because Elizabeth von Hautz argues that regardless of whether or not the Normans after Rollo were meaningfully Scandinavian, they certainly understood themselves as descendants of Scandinavian pirates. You know, they seem to have been somewhat proud, but also insecure about their pagan past, but they didn't reject it at all. If anything, they sort of doubled down on it by having these epic poems like the one by Dudo that expresses how even though their ancestors were pagan Vikings, they were also virtuous, and then eventually they did become Christians after all.
It's nowhere near as contentious as it is in Russia, but this is basically the same Norman debate that we talked about.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's Normanism again, this time with actual Normans. Van Hout would argue that at least until the end of the 12th century, the Normans were very proud of their Viking heritage and constantly reminded their subjects about that in the kinds of art and literature that they commissioned. There also was long-term contact with Scandinavia after Rollo's time, which you don't see elsewhere in France. So even if the initial wave of Norman settlers might have very quickly become culturally French, many other Scandinavians across the 10th and 11th century would come to the duchy and set up shop there. It was a real hub. And because of this might be why there is some lingering Scandinavian political influence in Normandy, and even by extension in England, just not in the ways you'd expect. I think the most important aspect of Viking legal influence on the Normans is the fact that the Normans had the right to exile, which meant that whenever a member of the aristocracy was guilty of a crime for which the punishment was death, they could instead choose to leave Normandy forever. This is still a pretty harsh choice, but it's not a choice that other aristocrats in Europe were typically offered. And again, Van Houtz believes this is directly an adoption of the Norse tradition of ulok, which means exile.
So it's hard to know exactly how many Vikings settled. There's no data, so we run into the same kind of demographic arguments we discussed in our episode on the Franks. So a lot of towns in Normandy today have Scandinavian names, so presumably many of everyday residents of the duchy were Scandinavian migrants.
Right, and there's actually even a town in Normandy today called Letingland, where presumably a thing was once held, which I think is pretty cute.
Yeah, there needs to be a rage comic about Letingland.
Yeah, but the most important town, we know though that the most important town in Normandy was not Letingland, it was Rouen, which was briefly actually a major slave port, interestingly, and was probably the biggest trade center for human property in Western Europe. This is clearly a Viking, an aspect of Viking influence. You know, it's possible that there might have been slavery in Rouen before, but the Vikings tended to be more eager slavers than European Christians. I don't want to exonerate Christian Europe of involvement in slavery because there was slavery all over the place, including in England and France before the Normans. But during this period, especially in the 10th century, Rouen really grew as a trade center, but initially that trade was in people. One interesting consequence of this is that this constant influx of foreign captives meant that Rouen would have a very international character.
Yeah, so according to the laws of medieval Europe, and medieval Islamic lands too, for that matter, the importation of non-Christian slaves from Iberia, North Africa, and Eastern Europe were just totally fine, completely legitimate, and Muslims had the same practice for non-Muslims. But there were in fact fears in the French court that many of the slaves being sold in Rouen were in fact Christians from Ireland and England who had been kidnapped, and specifically because they're Christians, that's a bridge too far.
Right. And so possibly in response to this scrutiny, slavery eventually starts to dry up in Rouen about after the year 1000. And it seems like by the time of William the Conqueror, it was no longer a major slave port. It was just a general trade center, especially for wool and other goods. Another possibility is that as Scandinavia and parts of Eastern Europe became Christian, and also as new kingdoms like Denmark and Poland consolidated, there probably was a lot less tribal warfare, at least among pagans, which meant there was not as much of a supply of captives, of pagan captives, that could easily legally be enslaved. So even though there might have been fewer people entering the city in chains, Rouen still was a very big, very international city, which is kind of interesting to note. It seems to have been one of the most ethnically diverse cities in Europe at this time because of these Viking trade networks. And so historian Neil Price argues that this is a pretty typical aspect of Viking settlements. The Vikings would set up trade ports abroad in places like Ladoga in Russia or Dublin in Ireland. And even though Scandinavian merchants would have would get the best deals, would have the most rights, other merchants from all over the world, particularly neighboring parts in Europe, would also go to these sites. And so this is kind of why Rouen because of the Viking influence, became this major trade center. One writer in the 12th century complained that when you go there, half of the people you meet only speak Danish, because there were so many recent migrants as late as the 12th century coming to do business there.
Yeah, and this is 200 years after Rollo's time, so these people must have continuously been coming in.
Right, and so even if the Norman elite might have been very Frankified in a lot of ways, they were still, number one, very proud of their Scandinavian heritage, and they were also in constant contact with Scandinavia in ways that the rest of France was not.
And besides all the migration from Scandinavia, there were even a lot of English residents of Rouen even before 1066. And in addition, the city was home to one of the largest Jewish communities in France, and they even had their own yeshiva. Yeah, Normandy seems to have been something like the motherland for the Jewish community of medieval England. Historian Norman Gold believes that the Rouen could have been close to a quarter Jewish, which is pretty insane.
Pretty big, yeah. And we have one cool account from the 11th century that kind of explains all this and says that Normandy in general is a place where all the races of the world come together and are shaped into a single people. And to me, this says, in addition to being, very international, this indicates that although Norse aspects of Norman culture might have pretty quickly dissolved, the various cultures within Normandy were acculturated into a shared Norman identity that acknowledged this Norse influence. There wasn't any kind of long-term ethnic division between the Normans and their French-speaking subjects. Everybody, commoners and elites, seem to have, at least according to outsiders, seem to have been considered a single group. But one thing we should talk about, though, is that, so we talked about how Viking were the Normans. Another question is, I think, how French were the Normans? Because especially from the US, we tend to look at the Normans from the other side of the English Channel. And from the English perspective, there are not readily discernible distinctions between Norman French speakers and Parisian French speakers, or even French speakers in the south of France. But these distinctions were incredibly important to the French aristocrats, and even are still somewhat significant today.
And despite their foreign names, the Normans really did readily adopt French culture, but also they left their own mark on the region. For instance, they had their own language, which was pretty close to Parisian French, but still identifiably different. It's a lot more conservative in pronunciation, which means it's more phonetic today.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame that Norman French isn't the one that became the international standard, because it might be a little bit easier to learn if you're an English speaker. There is a small but important Norse influence on the Norman dialect. Something like 150 words from Norse are used in Norman French, which isn't a tiny amount, like it's small but not insignificant. But that's probably not as much as the amount of Norse influence on English, actually.
Yeah, do you know what kind of vocabulary they happened to take from Norse?
Perhaps unsurprisingly, it's a lot of military and maritime words.
Yeah, same deal as Russian.
Makes sense. Yeah. Actually, interestingly, speaking about English, English itself had some influence on Norman French because after the conquest, there was just constant movement across the channel. So one of the English words they use in Norman French is they say cabbage for cabbage, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, and ultimately this would evolve into the monstrosity known as Law French, which is just basically like a pidgin language between French and English, which would have been spoken in British courts until like Victorian times even, I think.
You even hear it, there's snippets of, Law French are used today, like oyez in the US Congress, all that, yeah.
Oh, I didn't realize that was supposed to be French.
Unfortunately, we don't know that much about the Norman French language, at least as it was in the Middle Ages, because we really only have a single writer in it. Because people like Dudo we talked about, they either wrote in Latin or in Parisian French. But there is one guy named Wace, who I've never read his work. He was a medieval poet, but he's the best source for Norman French. But even, beyond the French language, the Normans eagerly embraced many aspects of the Latin Mediterranean world, and this was true for settlers in Italy and Sicily as well. So we can list off some examples of the kinds of, Latin, French, or Italian traits that were really eagerly adopted by the Normans. One of the most visible today is that Norman architecture was based on Roman rather than Scandinavian traditions. So all those castles and churches that they built across Italy and England, they're very Roman in a sense.
Yeah, and one thing that isn't visible today, but which was very perceptible at the time, was that the Normans, they knew their way around a horse in more ways than one. Well, at least their ancestors did. But anyway, that's a different topic. This was really a huge departure from the martial traditions of the Vikings themselves. So the Normans, they would become really renowned for their cavalry charges, which was used to really devastating effect against the Anglo-Saxons all the way in 1066 when William the Conqueror went over. And this likely played a very significant role in Norman successes in the Mediterranean as well. Yeah.
And in terms of other cultural traditions adopted from the French, intriguingly, there's a lot of references at the time to how medieval Normans were really into apple cider, which is kind of funny. And William the Conqueror, actually, he loaded up his ships to go to England for the conquest with all this apple cider in anticipation of, a victory celebration, which I gotta assume was kind of like the medieval version of a Gatorade shower.
Oh man, that sounds awful.
I think how sticky it must have been, no showers. Yeah, no, but beyond cider, the Normans had these huge quantities of French wine from the Rhineland constantly being shipped in, not just to Normandy, but also to their later holdings in France and even as far off as Sicily. One thing I find kind of interesting is that the Norman aristocracy in England would become a huge market for French wine, and even today, England actually consumes the most French wine per capita of any country outside France. So some of these things, kind of keep on. This brings us to kind of the last question of this episode, talking about, Gatorade showers and all the alcohol and all of this, which is, to what extent were the Normans barbarians? Which brings us back, to the start of this episode. Were the Normans, in any significant way, less civilized than, the Christian French people they assimilated into? And I'm kind of curious what you guys think.
Initially, obviously not, because they were coming into a culture that was foreign to them. But within a couple of generations, being a Norman, as we mentioned previously, was more of a cultural signifier rather than something that you did.
Right. And this is, again, we talked about Italian Americans, and I think that's a really good parallel, honestly, because, there's a lot of ways to culturally to express being culturally Italian American. Just watch any movie like from, by Scorsese. It's there's a lot of cultural signifiers, and this is true for many cultural diasporas. So I would guess that the Normans had cultural signifiers as well that might not have been directly from Scandinavia, but showed that they were people of Scandinavian descent in a society where that was essentially looked down upon. I think that when you're looking at telling the story about Normans versus Frenchmen, you definitely get kind of a slobs versus snobs vibe. And even though the Normans definitely were quite bloodthirsty and, rapacious, I think you do kind of got to see them as underdogs. I think it's kind of funny that, there's this idea that I think a lot of English people have that they were like the hard scrabble common folk and the Normans were the snooty wine sippers. But I'm not really sure if that was true back then.
It wasn't just the French who resented the Normans. So contemporary Byzantine writers like Princess Anna Komnena found the Normans from France to be really particularly bloodthirsty and crude, and even while employing Varangians straight from Russia and Scandinavia in their own court, they still thought these guys were just uncouth and uncivilized barbarians.
Yeah. And the English themselves, who had a pretty sophisticated legal system, they thought the Normans were backward because they had a much simpler legal system. And after the conquest, some English writers actually complained that, Canute, he was a Viking, but at least he had more respect for our traditions than this guy William does.
Yeah, they didn't miss me yet for Canute.
They did, yeah. Exactly, yeah. Again, we talked about French Christians believed the Normans were insincere in their conversions. They were all secret pagans. But to their part, the Normans did eagerly patronize the church. And eventually they'd have close ties to the Pope himself. We talked about how William Longsword and Richard I, they were big papal donors. And eventually some French writers would begrudgingly admit that the Normans donated more money to Catholic institutions than any other members of the French elite. But some of these French writers said it was only because they were, paying reparations for all of the crimes against Christendom that their parents did. So, you can never win.
Haters gonna hate.
Well, yeah, that's kind of basically it for the early Normans. It's a really fun topic. One last thing that we can kind of close on maybe is that that kind of brings us together. The question about the Normans as barbarians, the Normans as Vikings, the Normans as Frenchmen, or maybe as something somewhere in between. We have letters from the Archbishop of Rouen that suggest that local churchmen deliberately allowed certain elements of pagan belief to be recuperated by Christianity. This kind of cultural syncretism is something that we've talked about before in this topic, especially when it comes to, in that episode on the Lion in Winter that we talked about, we mentioned to what extent are any Christmas traditions reliable attestations of previous pre-Christian belief. It's really hard to know what has survived and what hasn't, but this does show that at the time, there was, in the early Middle Ages, there was an acknowledgement that a lot of Christian practice was really just kind of pagan practice in Christian drag. According to a later French tradition, Rollo himself would maintain faith in both Jesus and the Norse gods for his entire life, and that he prayed to Jesus on his deathbed while also making human sacrifices to Odin and Thor.
Yeah, I mean, just all of these people were growing up in a culture with a worldview that was utterly alien to the Christian one. That includes worship, morality, just everything across the spectrum. Like, at first, it would have been very difficult for the original invaders to adopt the Christian faith, but over time, naturally, their children, they would come to grow up in this milieu natively, and so they would find it to be much more intuitive.
And so my last question for you guys is that, do you think, or it's two questions really, and first, do you think the Normans were uniquely flexible at adopting local traditions wherever they went? And number two, do you think this might be part of why they were able to stay along a lot longer than any other Vikings who tried to put down roots, or really most other barbarians in general across European history?
I think it was mostly just the luck of the draw, because there's nothing really that separated what the Normans at this point were doing compared to what the Rus were doing, for example.
That's true, yeah.
They definitely got some good land. They definitely started with some good land, I'll say that.
Yeah, that's true. They did have kind of an advantage. Like, the Vikings in Dublin, like, come on, you get, like, a port in a swamp versus this huge chunk of France.
And I guess that is luck, though, but still, they certainly used it skillfully.
And I also kind of wonder, like, it is interesting that these guys, the Normans, they were basically the last barbarian group in Europe to do this. In other parts of the world, you have later cases of nomadic peoples, including in Eastern Europe, of nomadic peoples coming in and establishing new dynasties. But you don't really see anything like this again. It's almost kind of like an end of the Wild West kind of thing, nobody would recreate the Norman victories after this. And is it because of anything unique to the Normans? Is it just luck? Or is it because the world they were living in was no longer a world where barbarians were able to exist?
Well, yeah, at a certain point, this mode of living just became unproductive and unviable as these peoples whom they would traditionally raid got more used to the fact that these Vikings of various stripes fight in a certain way, and we can do X, Y, Z to fight them off. Yeah, that's true. There were no longer as many like kind of pull pressures for these kinds of peoples to, embark on these violent incursions, Yeah, and again, as we mentioned in the Northman episode, this was part of the state formation process because the kings of Norway and Sweden and Denmark, they would not want other people to have an independent power base, which they could leverage to seize the throne for themselves.
And that's also a really good point. Maybe it's just that, as Scandinavian dynasties came together, it was kind of like I know this is a loaded term, but it was kind of like a civilizing process in Scandinavia itself. And so there were fewer groups around to embark on these journeys. These kinds of journeys that even before the Vikings, many groups across Europe had undertaken. These kind of, migratory wars. I guess that just about wraps it up for the early Normans. Thank you guys so much for coming on with this. I hope our audience likes this one. We're almost certainly going to talk about the Normans again. Stay tuned for some more Robert Guiscard cyclo-guided content, because that is a really fun topic.
Yeah, Gladio is currently part of the Norman cinematic universe, so watch the space.
Yes, we absolutely are. Now, like you said, we ended up doing a lot more Viking episodes than we ever planned to. But clearly, we've heard good things, so it's what our fans want. So that's, good to know. If you are a fan listening and you don't hate us and you enjoy this podcast, please let us know what you like,
If you are a Norman yourself, please come and raid.
Yeah, come raid our DMs.
Think of my DMs as the beautiful monasteries of southern France.